Last night, I was watching a video and it brought up a memory my brain must have blocked out for years. And now I'm haunted by it again. I was 13 years old, hanging out with my best friend. We lived in a small town in Wisconsin, and it was the 90s, so there wasn't much to do. No smartphones at that time, kiddos wink wink. So we would always walk around town and play in the woods. On this day, we decided to walk the railroad tracks. We chat about boys and have a bunch of giggles while getting to the wooded area of the tracks that go on until the next town miles away. Halfway into our journey, I hear a baby crying. I look at my friend as we continue our stride, thinking she'd have some sort of facial expression acknowledging it. Nope. I kept on walking for another minute, just silently asking myself why there's a baby crying. Finally, I just stop and look at my friend and say, "Why is there a baby crying? We're out in the woods. Where's it coming from?" My friend looks at me with a confused face, and to my dismay, she says, "What are you talking about? I don't hear anything." She laughs at me, and we continue our stride. Mind you, I still hear this constant wailing of a baby. As we're walking, I have 10 billion questions going on in my head, and become increasingly agitated as the crying wouldn't stop, until it became a sheer, almost painful, loud screaming. It was at that point again where I stopped dead in my tracks, pulled my friend's arm, and I burst into tears. "You have to hear that. Where is it? Where's its mom? It sounds like it could be hurt." My friend treated me like I was a lunatic and continued to make a point that she hasn't heard anything. While we're arguing, the crying stops. A sigh of relief, I shift my head down in disbelief at it all. Looking at my feet, I noticed I was standing on something in the gravel in the middle of the tracks. I said, "What's that?" Pulled on the scrap that was visible to reveal something that gave me instant chills down my spine. A baby onesie. Tattered up, I immediately felt sick to my stomach. My friend's eyes got wide and I said, "Let's get out of here." We never went back. I don't know what I experienced that day, or why it's been blocked from my memory for 15 years, but it truly terrified me. Let me know your opinion, as I'm still at a loss. In my younger days, just after high school, I was what most would consider a vagrant. No home to speak of, but not quite homeless either. Growing up poor in a poor, dying factory town assures few things. But most of the kids in my town knew and understood clearly that the only way to escape such a bleak place was to leave. Find work somewhere else and don't come back, unless you want to be trapped forever. And I was no exception to this understanding. It was the result of this desperate retreat from certain poverty that led me to work as a labourer in the pipeline industry. Grueling work, but decent pay. A fair start for one such as myself. After about 3 months of working, my foreman, who we'll call Jay, discovered I was staying at a motel and wouldn't have it. He was kind enough to invite me to stay with his family until I found an apartment, and I was grateful for his offer. Jay and his family were honest rural people who lived in an honest rural area. A house with a barn and a field, surrounded by the wooded hills of Chillicothe. No neighbours and one road in and out. Very similar to houses I had seen and been around growing up. It was a great area and great company, and I was thankful for such a turn in my luck. The first evening I stayed there, Jay's wife got me situated in my room, and I became acquainted with everyone in the house over dinner. After our meal, I stepped out for a cigarette, and decided the tree line behind their barn would be the best area to smoke privately and inoffensively. The sun had set and then some by the time I stepped out of the house. The moon was high and full, keeping the valley I was in dully illuminated and casting the surrounding hills as dark shadows against the star-filled sky. A night that I think most would find peaceful. But as soon as my boots met the grass, that primal instinctive warning than a man gets sometimes, began to slowly creep into my core. That alarm that tells you something ain't right here. Being young and dumb and brave, of course, I shrugged it off and continued to the tree line, attempting to keep the growing feeling at bay. When I at last approached the shadowed tangle of trees and underbush on the outskirts of their yard, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my pack of Marlboros and my matches, and struck it alight. As I brought the match to my cigarette, I saw it. Mere feet away from where I was standing, just barely within the trees, was the stark and outstanding silhouette of something huge. It stood crouched and still had to be at least 7 feet tall. Large pointed ears and a narrowly elongated snout. Its eyes glimmered that weird infrared colour you see when animals reflect light in their eyes at night. Oh my god, there's a wolf! That's a wolf! Were my initial panic-stricken thoughts. It was in the midst of this processing that I realised there was no way this was a wolf, because wolves don't stand upright, and this creature was unmistakably on 2 legs. It was slouched low. One arm hung down past its haunches, and the other was pressed firmly against a tree to the right of it. Broad shoulders and savage posture. It didn't move. It didn't seem startled or threatened or afraid, but simply aware. It knew I saw it, and it knew that I knew. I wish I could say I did something. Anything. I wish I could say that I ran, or that I screamed, or even moved, but I was frozen in fear. Standing rigid as a statue, and nothing but a quickly dying matchlight between me and whatever monstrous thing was in front of me. We locked gazes for what felt like hours, but what was probably only moments. And as though the creature had decided it was done terrifying me, it straightened up and backed away slowly into the darkness of the trees. No sound, not a broken twig or rustled leaf to be heard. As soon as my legs allowed me, I ran like hell back to the safety of Jay's house, slammed the door behind me, and was met with a look of concern from my foreman and his wife, who were watching TV in the living room. "There's something out there," was the only thing I could gasp. Jay exchanged a glance with his wife and looked back towards me. "Boy, if you're going to stay here, you need to understand that there's things out in the woods that you best not pay attention to." He said it so nonchalantly, like he was talking about last night's football game. You hear a strange noise and you ignore it. You see a strange shadow, you ignore it. And if you get a strange feeling, you come inside and forget you felt it. There are things out there we just don't understand, but we respect it, because it's their land. We just live here. It's been 15 years since my encounter with that creature in the woods, and I still think about it often. And though I stayed with Jay and his family for another 3 weeks after that night, I never felt easy on this property. That feeling never left. That warning stayed alert. And I will never go out to the woods at night unless I have absolutely no other choice. Once you know what's out there, you never see things the same again. I know this might seem far-fetched, and I know that many won't believe what I'm saying, but this story I had to share. The sound of Caleb's rifle erupted, launching a clashing and artificial crack against the otherwise still sounds of nature all around us. Less than an instant later, a small metallic ping could be heard in response, some 50 yards or so away from where we were standing. "Which one were you aiming at? The right one?" I asked as I raised my binoculars to eye level. "Nah, the middle one," Caleb retorted nonchalantly. "It's further out than the other two." As my eyes began to adjust to the sudden magnification of the world around me, I moved the binoculars over to where I recalled the center target being. A small metal dartboard-style concoction of rings and dots, perched on a swivel, came into view, mounted above the stump of a felled tree. I could see it rocking slightly back and forth against the world around it from the percussion of the shot. Just left of the bullseye was the silver-grey indentation, contrasting heavily against the clean painted reds and blacks of the target. Undoubtedly where the bullet had found its mark. Just left of centre, I mumbled, eyes still pressed against the scopes. Pretty damn close, though. That should be alright, I reckon, Caleb said as he continued to reload his rifle. I'm not really looking to hit it right in the heart valve. Anywhere in the chest will do. I put my binoculars down and left them hanging around my neck as I grabbed my bag and my own rifle. I slung the bag around my shoulders and checked my gun once more to make sure it was loaded and that the safety was on. Alright then, I said with a slight air of impatience, let's kill a coy dog. 3 days prior, our grandfather had called telling us that something had been killing his chickens. He thought that it might have just been a raccoon at first, but after one of his dogs came limping out of the woods and onto his property, he seemed pretty convinced that he was dealing with a coy dog. The results of stray mongrels breeding with the region's coyotes had over the course of time resulted in a pretty sizable population of hybrid offspring, larger and far less timid than your average coyote. Coy dogs slowly began to make themselves more and more of a problem among the rural citizens surrounding this particular stretch of eastern Appalachia. My grandfather, being well into his 80s, no longer had the strength to go out and hunt wild dogs across the mountains. So he called me, and I had no idea to traipsy around the mountainsides in the evening by myself. I'd in turn called my brother, Caleb. It was this unassuming sequence of events that found us walking off into the woods of my grandfather's property against the setting sun. As we passed the fields and entered the tree line, we were met with a feeling of a comfortable welcoming back. The woods had always been where we belonged. And though our adult lives had resulted in us quickly becoming too busy in the towns and cities to spend as much time out here as we'd have liked, the ancient trees around us had not forgotten its former caretakers. And we had not forgotten them either. After scanning the ground around me for several minutes, I finally saw the first sign of our hunt. On the ground in some dampened dirt was the unmistakable footprint of a canine. Broken twigs and pressed plants indicated that the animal had begun making its way west and uphill. A few more steps revealed another set of tracks, affirming my suspicions. Tracks right there headed up the hill, I spoke over to my brother as I walked carefully in my intended direction. They were a little big for a coyote. I think this is the one we're looking for. Caleb nodded quietly and trailed behind me. Although I'd never admit it, Caleb was always the better shot between the two of us. And although we would never admit it, I was always the better tracker. But in our adult years, we understood each other's strengths and had no quarrel in trusting the other's observations, even if we didn't talk about it. Marching up the rugged terrain of the Appalachian foothills was always an arduous task. The steep incline and unpredictable earth would almost have a man walking on all fours up the hills from time to time. And if you didn't take a break periodically to chart your next few steps, you would quickly find yourself tumbling down the side of the hill into the hollow below. Cautiously, we made our way up the ever-increasing steepness of the hill. Our breathing began to get heavy, and our steps began to fall loudly and clumsily against the leaves and branches below our feet. Fuck, I'm out of shape, I cursed to myself as we continued our march. Caleb laughed with an exasperated air. Well, if we were looking to surprise this thing, we might as well head back down. I chuckled between breaths at the remark as we continued to half walk, half climb. After maybe half an hour of this exhausting process, we found ourselves at the top of the hill, panting like dogs and attempting to catch our breath. No way, Caleb said, breaking the silence. I looked up and around me to try and see if I could make out what he was looking at. It didn't take long. Ahead of us was the infamous jutting and pitch-black entrance of the Devil's Mouth, a large cave that we had known about for years. Our grandfather had forbidden us as children to ever go in there. Not wanting to adhere to the wrath of our grandfather, we had always abided by this rule. This implementation stayed with us through our teen years, and even as men, we found ourselves feeling nervous in the wake of the pitch black abyss, as if our 85-year-old grandfather was going to sprint up that hill and beat us silly for even stepping close to this place. On the wet ground below, the entrance were the trucks that we had been following most of the early evening, as prominent and indistinguishable as a set of tracks could be. You think Grandpa's going to whoop us for going in there after it? I laughed, as I nudged my brother in the arm with my elbow. Loudly, but with a hint of nervousness, my brother responded, "Geez, man, that old bear's got more life than the both of us combined. He's probably sprinting up here with the belt as we speak." I laughed in return to his depiction, completely capable of seeing this scenario in my mind. He was an old man, but he was a fierce man too. And when Grandpa gave you a rule, you listened to it, and that was that. But we were no longer children running through the woods of our grandfather's land, and the things that used to frighten us no longer held the effects that they once did. I looked over to my brother and observed him for a moment. Grey hair had begun to clash against the blonde under his hat. Wrinkles could be seen on his forehead. His sharp and chiselled facial features had begun to sag slightly under the weight of time, and crow's feet could be seen peeking out of the side of his brow, giving him the middle-aged look. With my brother being 3 years younger than myself, I knew in my heart that I was probably looking older than he was. I could start to feel it in my bones. When I woke up in the morning, when I went to bed at night, I could hear it in the things that I said. I could see it in the way that I had started to view the world around me. We're old men ourselves now, I reminded myself with a disappointed sigh. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. We don't have to be afraid of caves anymore. Well, I'd hate to have walked up that hill for nothing, I said, as I began to walk towards the mouth of the cave. Damn straight, my brother agreed from just behind me, as we passed the threshold into the devil's mouth. The light from the world outside the cave began to fade quickly, and before long, we were met with nothing but pitch black darkness. The unnatural kind that only being in places like a cave can make. It would make you go crazy if you stayed that way for too long, and would instantly heighten the other senses around you, subtly reminding you of how creepy places like this actually were. Suddenly, the cave was lit up by LED lighting. I looked over and saw that Caleb had pulled his handheld spotlight from his bag and illuminated the area with a ghostly white beam of light. He held it still on me as I pulled my own flashlight from the bag. The cave itself wasn't much to look at in retrospect. We looked around at the high ceilings and the moist walls around us in a sort of whimsical interest, the last uncharted region of our wooded paradise. It was in the midst of these observations that I heard Caleb whisper sharply. Obvious concern and growing anxiousness could be heard in his voice. "Look in front of you. Shit." There on the cavern floor, mere feet from us, was the body of the koi dog we had been tracking. Or rather, what was left of it. The creature lay in two places across the floor, connected by a trail of blood and strewn intestines. The front half of its head was smashed in from the top, crushed flat. Its tongue hung out of the top of its jaw in an almost cartoonish fashion. Brain matter could be seen splattered around its vicinity like organic confetti. All around the mangled koi dog's corpse were the assortment of other smashed bones. A ribcage over here, a fractured skull over there, pelvis bones and leg bones, and antlers seemed to litter the entire cavern floor. Slowly, we began to step back. I raised my rifle over my left arm, holding the flashlight in place with my hand. I could tell from the adjustment of light beside me that my brother had done the same. Fear began to creep into my thoughts, and I became on high alert to the dully illuminated area around me. Eyes darting back and forth at the shapes of the cave, trying to make out the silhouette of something I prayed I wouldn't see. "We're in a fucking bear den," my brother said suddenly. making me jump at the intrusion of sound in the eerily silent cave. At first I agreed with him. What else could have killed so many things, and in such a manner? It didn't take the county coroner to deduce that these animals had been killed by something big and heavy. There wasn't any other animal it could have been, not in this area of the world. We've seen more than our fair share of black bears running around the forest as kids, and figured they'd have to be living somewhere, but never in 1,000 years would we have imagined ourselves standing in the middle of one of their dens. It was in the midst of these panic-stricken thoughts that I remembered a detail, a small one, but one I couldn't shake. Breaking the silence of the death-filled cave once more, I addressed my brother. "There weren't any bear tracks, though," I said to him as we peered into the darkness with rifles raised. "Why wouldn't we have seen bear tracks outside the cave? I don't see any gnawed bones either. They're just smashed." "What do I look as, a scientist?" he whispered back almost in a shout. "Maybe he's hibernating or something. I don't know." I shook my head at the speculation. It was only late July. Bears wouldn't be hibernating until much later in the year. "It's too early for all that," I responded. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't before. Sitting on a rock, just behind the ruined coy dog's body, was a skull I had never seen before. 2 rows of teeth jutted out between the jaws, some pointed like an animal, others flat. 2 sockets where the eyes might have been stared emptily at us from across the cave. The skull was undeniably a human, but there's no way that could have been possible. The skull in question was huge, bigger than both of our heads put together. Again, the county coroner wouldn't need to be called up here. Any fool with half a brain could tell you this skull was way too big to be a man's. "What the fuck is that?" I almost shouted, as I pointed my light towards the object I was looking at. In the darkness I hadn't seen it. Now in the light, it was horrifyingly obvious. Just below the skull was a hole in the cave floor, at least 12 feet around, and seemingly bottomless. "What the hell?" Caleb said, in an astonished and slightly fearful tone as his light remained transfixed on the enormous skull. "Have you ever seen anything like that before?" Astounded by what I was seeing myself, I shook my head. I've never seen anything even remotely close to what I'm looking at right now. But if there's a bear in here, then we would have seen it by now. I'm going to check it out. Slowly, rifle still raised, I inched my way to the hole in the ground, eyes scanning periodically for any other crevices or indicators of the cave stretching further out than we thought. The rifles we had were muzzle loaders, essentially just modernized muskets. Though a bear could certainly be killed by the guns we carried, we weren't going to get another shot if we missed, and I didn't want to take a chance at that if we somehow startled a bear that we hadn't seen in here. Through the silence of the cave, I could hear Caleb's footsteps trailing just behind me. Finally, we approached the side of the hole and looked down. Even with our flashlights, the void appeared bottomless. I kicked the leg bone of some type of animal over the ledge and waited for the echoes to return to us as they hit the bottom. But they never came. Thinking perhaps I'd over-focused and somehow missed the noise, I kicked another bone down and waited. Nothing. No sound at all. "Careful around here," I said as I walked around the perimeter of the hole towards the skull. "That might actually never end." "I'm not easy about this," Caleb responded. "I think we should get going." I agreed with what he was saying. The air around us had fallen unnaturally still, like something horrible was waiting for us to do something wrong, as if at any second, whatever had created this mess of bones would come flying into the cave and add us into its collection. "You're right," I said, as I continued to make my way forward. "He says as he continues to walk deeper into the serial killer's cave," Caleb approached, trying to mask his growing concern with sarcasm. "I'm taking this skull with us. We'll see what Grandpa thinks about it," I said, trying to reassure him that our time in this cave was coming to an end very soon. Suddenly, from the bottom of the chasm below, a loud and tremendous roar could be heard. It shook the walls of the cave and echoed violently all around us. Terrified, I screamed and tried to run back to the mouth of the cave, skull in hand. "Get out of here! Go, go!" I screamed at my brother as he stared, eyes widened in shock. I'd hoped that he'd snap out of it by the time I got to him. As I continued running, I was suddenly grabbed and flung to my face hard by something behind me. Red hot pain seared through my knees and head as I tried to pull myself up. But whatever had caused me to trip was now pulling at me, trying to drag back into the cave and into the hole. I screamed as I flailed about the cavern floor, trying desperately to grab onto something that would slow my inevitable death. But there was nothing to grab. Hopelessly, I clawed at the earth as I felt myself being dragged further and further away. A loud bang filled the area around me. Light flashed, vibrantly for less than a moment, before my eyes were again introduced to the darkness of the cave. Whatever the entity was that had grabbed me loosened up, just enough for me to kick myself free. Like mad, I clambered my way onto my feet, but again quickly fell down with excruciating pain. I screamed out as I tried to pull myself up. As I tried to rise, I heard another bang. Ears ringing, surrounding in darkness and losing consciousness, with the horrible agony coming from my left leg. I desperately clawed my way towards the mouth of the cave, trying to get away from the cavern I was being dragged to. I felt a force pick me up and heard Caleb's voice through the ringing, muffled and distorted. Come on, help me out here." With Caleb holding me up, we escaped the cave and somehow made our way back down the hill into the valley below. Limping along with the desperation of a wounded animal, trying in vain to escape the predator we were sure was coming for us. We made it to the bottom and looked around in wide-eyed fear. There was nothing. Just the sound of night birds and crickets in the forest around us. I groaned out again in pain and braced myself as the wave rose and slowly faded back to its steady, dull ache. "What the fuck was that? What the fuck happened?" I screamed at my brother, who continued to look up the hill in shock and unchecked fear. He turned around and pulled me up again. As we limped through the forest towards my grandfather's house, he spoke. It was a hand," he said, in disbelief through the pants and heavy breathing. "It came out of the hole and tried to pull you in. I shot it twice." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He had to have been mistaken. "You mean like a paw?" I gasped through the pain in my leg. "Like a bear's paw?" "No, not like a goddamn bear's paw," he yelled at me in a complete loss of composure. "Like a fucking hand. Like 5 fingers and knuckles and an elbow. Like a hand. It shot out of that hole and almost killed you, dude." Another wave of anguish seared through my leg and seemed to travel up my body, clouding my thoughts. "I think my leg's broken, Caleb." "Yeah, your leg is definitely broken. Stop talking. We're almost back." Before I could respond, the world faded out into darkness. I woke up several hours later in the hospital. My grandfather sitting at the corner of my bed with the same look of stern disapproval he always wore. "Told you not to go into that cave, boy," he said sharply and matter-of-factly, never showing the slightest trace of emotion. "Don't got yourself broken by a bear, the doctor's saying. It's lucky little Caleb was with you." I looked around at the hospital room I was in and didn't see my brother anywhere. "Where is he?" I asked as I tried to prop myself up. The exhaustion mixed with the pain medication I was certainly on resulted in me collapsing back into my bed in defeat. "Stop moving, you damn fool," my grandfather remarked, seemingly unconcerned at my lack of strength. "Your leg's busted in 3 places. You got enough Percocet to kill a horse. He's fine. He's outside talking to cops." I laid in the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the thoughts that were coming back to me. Finding the cave, being grabbed, running through the woods. The doctors must have thought it was a bear. It had to have been a bear, I rationalised to myself. Caleb just freaked out. It was dark. He couldn't see it well. Just then, my grandfather spoke up again. "I always just thought kids had no business running around in deep, dark caves," he said, with an air of elderly reminiscence. Never in 100 years could have told you there was a bear in that hole. Cherokee, who used to live here, talked about giants living deep in there. Big old man-eaters with 2 rows of teeth. Shocked at what my grandfather was telling me, I looked over to where he was sitting in a wide-eyed expression. Well, you're alive. I'm dying of boredom. I'm going home and going to bed. The old man pulled himself up and stammered over to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. Give these here to your brother when he gets back. He put his hand on my chest and patted my shoulder with his other hand before making his way out of the hospital room. I looked down and stared in horror and disbelief at what my grandfather had placed into my hands. Tied in an old string was a necklace made out of teeth. Way too big to be a man's. Some sharp like an animal, some flat. Let me preface this by saying this story is completely true. I didn't experience it, but my mother is very much a I have to see it to believe it type, and while religious, is still quite realistic. Some years ago, I lived in Savannah with my dad and stepmom, who I'll be calling V for this story. V's mother, my step-grandmother, was sick at the time and lived in central Georgia. Each Friday, V and I would drive from Savannah to her home to take care of her for the weekend, clean the house, etc. We'd drive home Sunday night and be back in Savannah by about 11. At the time, I was working a part-time retail schedule, so I didn't always have weekends off. In 2015, on one weekend when I couldn't go, V called me Sunday night sounding worried. Her tyre had rapidly lost air on the way back. We later found out that her father had worked on her car over the weekend and neglected to completely screw the cap back on. Her tyre was now flat, and the Georgia backyards are rarely maintained and are often little more than barely held together piles of gravel. Driving them with a flat tyre is extremely dangerous. I asked her location and offered to drive out and meet her. She agreed. I hung up and headed out to meet her somewhere near Dublin. A little under an hour later, she called me back, immediately starting with, "You are not going to believe what happened." In her own words, a short time after our call ended, a truck pulled onto the road from out of nowhere and came up behind her. Out got 2 young men. She was frightened and put down the window barely an inch to talk to them. They asked if she needed help, and she said yes. One of her tyres was flat. They offered to escort her to a nearby, somewhat hidden gas station to air up her tyre. She agreed, but made sure to keep a knife within reach in case things went south. As promised, they led her to a gas station off of some little dirt road. According to her, the place didn't even look like it was open. But it was brightly lit, and there was a working air pump. She got out to fill her tyre, and, as most pumps were until recently, it was cash only. Well, coin only. She had none. Then, one of the men told her to check the coin return. She did, and found 6 quarters, exactly enough to air up her tyre. They told her not to worry and went to work, airing up, and checking all of the tyres. Although she tried to offer a monetary reward next time she came through, they refused. They told her that they often did this, and all they wanted to do was to help. The only thing they wanted in return was for her to attend church the next week and to pass on the kindness to someone else. She said that as they got into their truck, she could almost see a faint golden glow about them. She never saw them on that road again. To this day, she is totally convinced that she met a pair of angels. I don't know what she met, but I'm very, very happy that they were benign. So my friend had moved into a shared house in the old side of Roseville, California. He invited me over about a week after moving there. He lived with a couple of girls who were in a relationship, and also moved his newish girlfriend in with them. The girls occupied one end of the house near the backyard, and my friend and his lady were in the bedroom next to the front yard. There was another bedroom in the middle of the house that connected to my friend's room via a conjoined bathroom. This was the only bathroom in the house. So the first night, my friend invites me over to hang out. I'm at work, closing manager at Taco Bell, and I tell him it'll be a couple of hours before I can come over, and he says that's fine. They just made some edibles and there were plenty to spare, so come on over and chill. A couple hours later, I get off and head over to his house. Upon knocking on the door, the two roommate girls answered. They told me that my friend and his girlfriend had eaten some edibles right after making them, and promptly passed out after inviting me over. Not that surprising when it comes to my friends. They invited me in anyway, since I had made the drive out, and also brought some weed with me. We played All-Star Battle Royale on PS4 until about 2 AM. When they were turning into bed, they directed me towards the guest bedroom. So the layout of the guest bedroom is as follows. It's right off of the living room, and it's conjoined by the bathroom to my friend that I came to visit's bedroom, where he and his girlfriend were sleeping. There was also a pulled-down attic door on the ceiling, near a standard sliding door mirror closet. When I had first entered the room, I jokingly said to one of the girls that the attic was creepy as hell, and I had to open the door once myself to know what kind of noise it made, so I'd know when to nope the hell out if I heard it while sleeping. So about 15 minutes later, I'm ready to sleep and I'm plugging my phone into the wall socket and setting an alarm. As I'm slightly bent over messing with my phone, I hear the telltale creaking noise of the attic door opening. I spun around and looked up, and sure enough, it was open a few inches, but there was nothing but darkness to be seen in the gap. It honestly scared me quite a bit, but the bed was much more comfortable than the couch we had been hanging out on earlier, so I was determined to sleep in the room, ghosts be damned. I mustered up the courage to close the attic door, with some effort mind you, and lay down to go to bed. A little while later, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard the noise of what sounded like my friend waking up, stretching, yawning, and walking through the living room. I laughed to myself a little bit, thinking that he probably had extreme dry mouth and was heading for some water. Then, I was suddenly struck by a feeling of dread. I didn't hear any footsteps as the voice crossed the living room. Immediately upon realizing this, the light switch on the wall by the door near the living room flips on hard, like someone slapped it up with force. My eyes were already closed when this happened, and I'm somewhat ashamed to say I shut them even harder when I heard the light switch. I laid there for a long time, artificial light searing through my eyelids and eerie silence hanging in the air. Eventually I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, and I don't know how long it took or what time it was. The next morning, I was the last person in the house to wake up. Everybody was up and in the common areas of the house, making breakfast and talking. The door from the guest room to the living room was open, and the light was off. Most strangely though, my socks were neatly folded and tucked behind a mirror leaning against the wall. Tucked as in pinned where the mirror was leaning against the wall, even though I had kicked them off while laying in bed. I walked out to where everybody was conversing and, after saying hi to my friend and making fun of him for passing out, decided I would talk to them about what happened the night before. I started off lightly with the questions, not wanting to be crazy friend who doesn't get invited back to hang out. So the conversation went as such. Hey guys, good morning. So, did anyone go into the bathroom last night through the room I was sleeping in? Various responses of nope, nah, we slept through the night. Okay, so nobody would have turned my light on then. Again, nope, didn't touch it, etc. And was it on this morning when you guys woke up and came out? Again, no, it was off when we woke up, and nobody said they turned it off. Okay, final weirdest question, I said, half laughing. Did anyone pick up my socks and tuck them behind the mirror? At this point, they all stopped what they were doing and were just staring at me. I thought my sanity was being seriously questioned when finally one of the girls said something along the lines of, wow, so the house is already messing with you? I stayed over at the house 4 to 5 days a week for the next few months because of my curiosity about the haunting and the property itself. There are a lot more occurrences I can write about if you guys are interested that ramp up in intensity as time goes on. Just let me know. So this was just a crazy phase in my life, so I'm going to tell it to the best of my ability, and I will be changing names to protect the identities of those who were involved. I was living with my roommates Phil and Lauren while I was dating my fiancée at the time. We were having random conversations about random topics, until Lauren started to talk about her trip to New Orleans and her visit to the old French quarters. She said that she stopped by a couple of gift shops and other little places where they sell souvenirs and things of that nature. Anyway, she mentioned to us how she saw a Victor doll from the Corpse Bride movie, and she was such a huge fan of Tim Burton that she needed to have it. But unfortunately, she didn't have enough money to buy it. So she took it upon herself to just take it. We all found it funny at first. It was something she would do, and at the time, we were just stupid kids getting out of high school. It was funny, up until she mentioned she stole the doll from a voodoo store in the French quarters. When the word voodoo was thrown in the air, some of the roommates that lived with us at the time found it even funnier, and the rest felt uneasy about the whole matter because she was mentioning how she would wake up with scratches and hear weird noises in the middle of the night. We let her know that what she did wasn't a good idea to begin with, and that she should find a way to properly discard the doll, but she insisted on keeping it. A couple of days go by, and she shows us some more scratches that she got in the middle of the night, and how she liked something was in the room, but she couldn't see it when she opened her eyes. A couple more days go by, and at the same thing happens, then she tells us that the doll moved from the spot she always had it. We were confused and looking at each other puzzled and asked, "You know where the doll went?" And she answered with confusion, "The doll was under my bed." We grabbed the doll and put it in the garage on top of a box where nobody would move it. I don't know why or how that would have been a good idea, but we stuck with it. I came back into the garage to smoke with Phil, and we didn't see the doll on the box where it was left. We looked on the ground next to the box, and there was the doll. It was almost like it was staring at us, mocking us. I was a little skeptical about it until we put it back and we all went to bed one night. And when we wake up, she comes back out holding the doll, with the look of fear on her face telling us that the doll made its way back in the room. I know she wasn't lying, because nobody ever goes in her room when she sleeps, especially since Lauren and Phil were dating, and he would work overnights, and she would stay up all night talking with him and watching movies. With that being said, she went to bed shortly after Phil came back, and when they woke up at 6 p.m, when everyone knew they hadn't stepped into their room, the doll ended up in some different spot of the apartment we lived in. The longer she had this doll, the worse things got. Our smoke detectors went off for no reason. Lights would be turning off and on for no reason. We would hear scratching on the walls in the bathrooms. We would occasionally smell sulfur in the air. And if that wasn't weird enough, Phil and Lauren's door would never stay open. It would always close by itself. We knew something was in that apartment, and we're all glad we're out. Unfortunately, Phil and Lauren split a couple years later and kept the doll, and he went to live his life. But wherever they are, I hope they're okay. And Lauren got rid of that God-forsaken doll. The story starts around Christmas of 2017 or 2018. Can't remember. My grandmother's husband, who died in 2001, and his youngest brother died Christmas morning, leaving only 1 or 2 siblings left of that entire generation. I didn't know him, so I wasn't even affected at all. Fast forward the next morning. I'm sleeping on a couch in the family room, with a coffee table near me. Not something to brush up my leg against, but given the fact that I was very close to a coffee table, I brushed it off as my leg fell off the couch and brushed up against the table. It was 5 past 5 in the morning. At around 5:15, I decided to get up and play some Xbox. But as I got up from the couch, I saw the lazy boy recliner across the room, rocking back and forth. All I saw was an indentation in the seat. I wasn't scared, but rather stunned that this was happening. Startled, I backed into the archway into the family room, shining my flashlight onto the chair. I woke up both my mother and brother who were sleeping in there. Lots of crammed people in a smaller house. I then got into the fetal position on the edge of my mom's bed, with my back facing the room I was just in. Then, a crazy thing happened. At the exact same time for the next 2 mornings, my brother, who was now sleeping on that couch, had the same thing happen to him. Nothing has been paranormal in that house ever since. I had a very interesting, if not downright chilling, conversation the other night. My fiancée and I drove into Tennessee to meet her grandfather for a night of whiskey, food, and music at a blues festival near Memphis. It's hard to argue with that combination. Southern food and music both have well-deserved reputations. It was a great time, but I suppose I should get to the thing that's been stuck in my mind. I remember after one of the sets, I had an opportunity to talk to a couple of the artists. There were two men, the first being Lee Curtis Jr. He was an older black gentleman, with a head of grey hair retreating from the peak of his head and curling around the sides, and a greying goatee that still held some of his youth in it. He held a world weariness about himself, a lifetime of struggle and travel resting on his face. The other man was Lee's son, an extremely friendly man named Scratch, who smiled brightly and joked often from behind the deep void of his sunglasses. His head was bald, and so was his face, save for the eyebrows. He slowly rotated a small glass of bourbon in his right hand, which was adorned with several rings. Both men were extremely well dressed, in fine suits, leather shoes and headgear with a look straight out of the 30s. They were very kind and accommodating, smiling and telling jokes while recounting local history and giving me a crash course in the blues, all while the alcohol steadily flowed. Eventually, the conversation landed on Robert Johnson and the Crossroads. Robert Johnson was a mythic figure in America, the guitar-playing bluesman, the man who sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads for the musical skill that would birth rock and roll. The wind felt winding and foreboding between us. "Oh, hell," he said. "You want devil stories? I can give you devil stories." Scratch looked at me grinning, like he knew what was coming, and spoke. "You done got the old man started," Lee interjected. "I'll tell the story to any goddamn buddy I want to." Scratch laughed into his bourbon, then leaned back in his chair. "Fine, you want to scare him off with that old voodoo shit? Be my guest," he said playfully. Lee cut back in, irritated. "Wasn't no damn voodoo boy, and you know it." He swatted at Scratch's leg, causing him to draw it away and laugh loudly. Then, Lee turned to me and began his story. The story goes: if you want devils in your blues, no better place to look than Old Scratch Lee. Old Scratch was my daddy, born Lee Curtis in 1907. Got killed in 1942. First thing you got to know about Old Scratch is that he was a stone-cold bastard. They called him Scratch since he was a child, Scratch being an old nickname for the devil, and rightly so. Old Scratch had been a real thief through his childhood, and people say he shot his first man at the age of 14. He ran with a bootlegging gang in the 20s, selling shine. Around the 30s, Scratch found himself the devil and picked himself up a guitar. Rumour was his mother and her father, before her all passed down, a book full of old demons' names, traditions of witchcraft and devil worship. They used to say Old Scratch's granddaddy first brought the devil to America. Said before he was free, he used to tell the other slaves the only way to defeat the white man and his god was by using the white man's devil. He taught everybody he could about how Lucifer was to be the breaker of shackles, the leader of their spiritual rebellion, something that got him beat and sold many a time. but that only spread his gospels. There was no doubt that Scratch learned some of his granddaddy black magic from his mother. After all, they only had each other for a good part of Scratch's life. It's natural that he would inherit something from her. After a time in prison in the early 30s, Scratch would never be seen without his partner in crime, a large and heavy tattooed white man called Brothel Jack. They called him that on account of his being born in a whorehouse. Some folks said Jack was a sailor, some said he was a soldier, but most folk said he was plain dangerous. Jack's reason for being locked up was that he'd beaten a cop, something the locals didn't take kindly to. One evening, this being a Kentucky prison, some racist idiots decided to attack Scratch. They'd gotten a hold of some barbed wire from the prison fence and tried to wrap around the poor man's head, scarring his neck and the top of his head to hell. Jack, being a very compassionate felon, jumped in and stabbed them good old boys about 10-20 times in the belly, each. As you can imagine, old Scratch and Brothel Jack were inseparable from then onward. Some folks say Scratch had found his attackers later on, killed them as a sacrifice, and swore himself to the devil in that prison cell. Some say Jack did it. Some would even say that Jack was the devil among them, watching over his favourite sinner. About a year later, Scratch was a free man, making his money playing the blues with such a haunting tone to it. It drove women to tears and men to violence. By the time Jack got out of that Kentucky prison cell, Scratch had a little money in his pocket, so he brought Jack out to Georgia to enjoy the blessings. By 1936, after a few years of the devil's luck, old Scratch finally got raked over the coals once again. The Klan had gotten wind of a black man singing hymns of praise to the devil round their parts. Didn't like it too much. It was a humid and miserably hot afternoon in Georgia. A raw and aching silence hung in the air on top of the screaming cicadas in the tree, until it was broken by the sound of hooves. The sounds of humanity's chicken shit dregs muttering slurs, and talking about what they would do to him. It was like death itself paraded through those dusty roads, crude and angular skeletons holding crosses. It isn't hard to see how old Scratch and his folk had hard feelings towards God, given that God's knights had come this particular night to kill him. Only the devil and Jack were on Scratch's side this time. Those animals beat Scratch's body, bound his wrists and marched him off into the dense woods. Brothel Jack stood and fought through 2 bullets but fell unconscious after savagely wounding a few of the Klansmen. Scratch sang while he walked deep in the woods. No matter how many times they hit him or threatened to shoot his ass, he just grinned and sang. Songs about loss, about revenge, about a pact with the devil. The cowardly ghosts prepared their half-assed execution site. 2 drunk Klansmen sloppily set up their cross to burn, while 2 more readied old Scratch's noose. Scratch just kept on singing, becoming more and more grim and wily, his eyes bulging and teeth bared. Blood seeped from gashes in his head, smeared on his cheeks. Scratch looked his killers in the eye and sang aloud, singing forcefully of a bloody witch's curse. He kept hollering until they put the hood on his head. Then all went quiet. The cross roared to a burning. Hatred fueled life in the dark night. The echoing of flames danced bright against the white robes of the executioners, and the black cloth hood that had been forced onto Scratch. For a while, they stood in a silent trance, absorbing the crackling of hot death and the absolute corrosion of the fire. When the smells of gasoline faded to smells of burning wood, the men in the sheets returned to that kill. "Kill that son bitch," one of them shouted. 3 of them ran to their ragged gallows and tugged away at the rope. Old Scratch felt the rope tear tight on his neck, and he levitated toward death, but made not one sound. Not even a thrashing once he'd been pulled up. The drunken ogres in their filthy white sheets whooped and hollered, downing their beers and generally behaving like fools. Well, boys, ain't that something? Into the groove where death was taking root walked a finely dressed black man. He wore a black fur coat with white lining and a black fedora. He walked in with no concern to his soon-to-be graveyard. He took a long drag from the stub of a fat cigar and lifted his head to meet those white men's eyes. He grinned and let smoke seep from that bright white grin. His eyes looked to be a deep void, a soul-gazing blackness with a reflective golden tinge. The eyes themselves seemed to be flecked with gold and spitting out small embers. He spoke. "Afternoon." He raised his eyebrows and the corners of his mouth as he talked. He spoke smoothly and sounded almost seductive. He raised his right hand and tipped his expensive suede hat. Scratch hung suspended, but his killers were now all fixated on the stranger. One of the robed men snatched his gun off his waist and walked forward with a false sense of power in him. He put 3 or 4 rounds into the stranger, but the man just laughed at him and said, "Ain't that a damn shame?" A sound rang out like the cracking of a whip. The ropes used to keep the burning cross upright had slipped, and the structure had dug past the weight securing it. The cross came crashing down upon the crowd of ghosts. 3 of the men in robes were killed damn near instantly. 2 of them got trapped under it, burned real slow and painful. A couple of them got their robes caught by the fire and ran screaming off to the woods to die. Amidst it all, Scratch came down from that tree. The last of the men who'd pulled old Scratch up into the air stumbled back and shouted in pain. An angry serpent with a shaker in his tail had struck and latched onto his hand, as if the noose's rope had transformed into a snake. The sucker ripped the snake from his hand and watched the poison-saturated blood trickle down black across his arm. He ran into the woods all hazy, forgetting about all his dead cohorts. Once the venom hit him, he stumbled and dripped with a vicious sweat in a haze. Trying to reach home, he reached home all right, but it was far too late. He was rambling about black devils and old Scratch following him in the woods. Before he died, he said he could see Scratch winding between the trees on all sides like a thin fog, strumming a beat-up old guitar. Said he was singing one of his songs, "Cut Me Down." They say the devil watches o'er his own, O deathless one, please cut me down. They say that's the night old Scratch sold his soul. He knew he was going to die and made that ultimate offer. They say Lucifer saved my daddy that night. Of course, that's just what people say. Lee leaned back in his chair and the grimness of the story faded, his face returning to weariness. I was dumbfounded at the story I'd just been told. Lee's son seemed entertained at the whole thing and was waiting on me to say the inevitable "holy shit" or something similar. But I found myself at a loss for thoughts, much less words. Don't listen to him, man. He just loves them old ghost stories, Scratch cut in, prompting Lee to exclaim again. "Ah, shut the hell up, boy," he shouted. "You don't know shit." Scratch collapsed, laughing in his seat, as did I. It was around this time when my fiancée found me again. I'd been so wrapped up in the wisdom Lee shared, I'd forgotten about the entire night before. I introduced her to Lee and Scratch, who greeted her very warmly. I exchanged contact info with Scratch. We're still in touch. We bid them farewell and made our way out of Tennessee toward home. I'm no stranger to tall tales, but Lee told the story with such sincerity and grimness, emanating from his every word. I couldn't find anything online about old Scratch Lee Curtis Sr., so I'm going to contact them and see if Lee will part with any more wisdom about his father's life. To be blunt, I have reason to believe someone is living in my house. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I'm being stalked, nor am I rushing to post on Reddit while hiding from an intruder. When small daily use items started going missing, I blamed it on my own bad memory. When I would wake up at night to piss and find all the lights in the house on, I shrugged it off. Too much to drink before bed, I would think. It had become a recurring joke in my head after the first week. the vengeful ghost lurking my house and stealing my DVDs. Into the second week, the signs started getting a little more extreme. I noticed deep spiderwebbing cracks in the glass frames of photos of my late wife. Do picture frames usually crack themselves without falling from the wall? I started noticing that more important, more sentimental things would be stolen, defaced, or placed in a different room. Wedding photos, old love letters, her old necklace that I couldn't bear to part with, all either missing or strewn across one of the empty rooms. Things escalated when my gun went missing 3 nights ago. At least, I didn't know it was gone until 3 nights ago. I heard some footsteps and banging around outside my bedroom. Thundering steps, like a torrent of large beasts pouring down the hallway. I scrambled to my closet for a weapon and had no luck, due to the aforementioned missing gun. I armed myself with my pocket knife, and as I flung open the door, I heard a loud crashing sound, like 2 cars made of glass colliding. I leapt out into the hall, knife pointed outward as if it were a bayonet and teeth bared. But I only found the source of the racket. Every picture on the walls of the hallway had fallen to the carpeted beige floor and seemingly exploded out of pure shock. I stalked around each corner of the house in thin silence until the sun bled itself through the shutters of each window. 2 nights ago, I was awakened by a knock on my bedroom door. I stumbled out of bed to the end of my room and hazily opened it to find no one. A small and delicate trail led off into the tempting darkness of the hallway. It shone and smeared on my fingers like blood, but it was much darker and thicker. It was more like cooling candle wax to the touch. In my fascination, I'd forgotten the potential intruder in my home and was wrested back to this thought by the heat of breath on the back of my neck. Each of the hairs there rose to stand on end. The heat of the breathing created a wetness on my neck, and the sound of it slowly sunk into my ears. I whipped around as if to catch the person off guard, swinging with my right arm and quickly falling on my ass like an idiot. Whoever it was behind me, they were gone. I quickly fled to my car and slept behind the closest gas station. Last night was inexplicable in nature. Things rose to a head in ways I'm still struggling to process. I woke to a voice. My wife's voice. I know it couldn't possibly be her, in the flesh. But in my half-awakened, naive state, I didn't question it. I heard her just beyond the bedroom door, soft and voice full of kindness. I opened the door. Nothing. I'm a fool. A harsh, crackling whisper like a death rattle of unseen origin flew down the hallway away from me and settled in the quiet. The hallway shook with magnetic force, almost knocking me to one knee. The decorations scattered about the walls of the hallway rattled and fell, shattering and making sounds so piercing, I'd have thought everything in the house had broken. Foolish, I walked off into the dark. Broken glass stung at my feet. I could hear faint whispers spiraling around me, but couldn't make out a word. Every minute instinct and every cell in my body screamed at me to run, to flee the house and never return, but an estrangement forced me further onward. On the living room wall, there were arrangements of handprints smeared and tossed about, most dripping far down the wall toward the floor. They appeared to be bloody, but I couldn't be certain in the dark. A few feet away from the hand paintings was a wet, aphotic stain akin to a puddle of vomit, with a consistently like viscera. It was a disgusting sight, and the very grime of the substance itself seemed to be crawling away from the mass in efforts to corrupt the rest of the room. It was then I heard a skittering behind me, the sound of long nails trailing across and down the hallway toward my bedroom. The sound of bare feet dragging along the carpet. I turned and was frozen, caught by the sight of the silhouette lurking and unable to act. My heart caught in my throat as I watched it slowly shamble toward the window in my bedroom and reach toward the curtains. It tore open the curtain, filling the room with the obscuring deep blue glow of the night and exposing itself to me. It couldn't have been, and yet it was. It was my wife, her face sunken and features gaunt, a mess of greenish black vomit stringing from her mouth that stained her chin and much of her exposed chest. Her eyes were dim as the dead eyes often are. They shone in the moonlight like two moons, reflecting off of the blue neon of her pallid flesh. She stepped from the window and faced me, though she didn't look at me. She stared distantly and aimlessly, as if she were blind and simply aware of my direction. She lifted one stiff arm, slow and jerking in motion. She pointed directly at me, and another mass of gory black vomit spilled out of her mouth limply. The door slammed shut with a thunderous impact so violent it had rocked me from my trance. I barreled down the dark hallway and threw myself with all of my strength into and through the door. Splinters of wood stabbed at me and littered the floor. About me, and pain bit into my shoulder and body. Nothing. There was no one in the room, and yet the curtain of my bedroom window remained open. The acidic puddle of her vomit still gurgled and stained on the floor of the room. I had to prove it to myself. There was no logical way that my wife's reanimated corpse had appeared in my house. But before I fled for the night, I had to make sure. I had to know. A manic trembling and anxiety hit me like a brick in the chest. I grabbed my keys and ran to the backyard, eyes darting between tree, bush, and shadow in paranoid indulgence. I unlocked the shed and swung the door open. She was just as I left her. Her body was propped up against the wall, sitting atop an old box of clothes, her legs together and severed from the knees down. Her arms were positioned as if her hands were clasped and sitting in her lap, except that her hands, too, were severed. She looked back at me with her lifeless, dim eyes and her matted hair, sticky with blood. The blood around her mouth and chin had thickened into a dark, blackening syrup that clung to her face. Nothing had changed. She was beautiful as ever. I stared in silence at her for a while before slamming shut and locking the shed door. I quickly rushed to gather my things and fled to avoid being confronted by the guest again. I could hardly sleep. I stared at a hotel ceiling for hours, restless. What precious little sleep I was given did little to relieve my fatigue. I didn't notice the handprint left in blood on the door of my car until I was departing to pick up my wife. I thought I was safe being somewhere far from the house, but she found me. No, it found me, and wanted me to know that it found me. I didn't have a moment to lose. I drove to the house and went straight for the backyard shed. Would you believe it if I told you the shed was empty? Well, not exactly empty. Where the body once sat, I found my pistol. It had faint fingerprint smudges in blood around the barrel. I snatched the pistol from its rest in a panic and ran to the car, then back to the hotel. I spent the last few hours questioning my sanity, questioning what I'd seen. How could this even happen? But about 10 minutes ago, I heard a knock on the hotel door. I looked through the peephole and saw an empty parking lot. A few minutes later, another knock. I looked once more and could not have dreamed of seeing what lay on the outside. I saw the blue-tinged, degenerating and nude corpse of my wife, standing at the end of the parking lot. It was facing away at first, staring aimlessly, but soon turned and revealed black vomit stained much of the front of her body. It felt like we had locked eyes, though there was no way she could have seen me. I ducked from the door immediately and hid. The knocking had become more and more frequent and heavy, almost primal. The black substance was rolling in pools from underneath the bottom of the hotel door. Just as I thought my death was certain, it all stopped, though the stains remained. Silence. I looked at my car, and it's covered in those black handprints. Should I risk making a run for it?